Okay, welcome to week 4. We're going to have 2 lectures. This is the first Islamic human rights scheme. So I'm here. I'm trying to show you a little bit some of the background, some of the thinking. I mean, it's pretty obvious. She writes well, but Anne Elizabeth is talking about human rights schemes, and I'm going to try and dig behind some of this. There's a lot of material she presents, and it's hard to disentangle some of that, and it's hard to really actually see the forest from the trees. So I'm going to try and help you do that in this lecture. Human rights schemes. These are the schemes that she covers. It's nice to have them all in front of you in one place. The first one would be Sultan Hussein's Sultan Hussein Tabandi's, a Muslim commentary on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Published in Persian, Farsi, 1966, 4 years later in English. He's a Sufi sheikh of a Persian order, founded in the 14th century. And he's a traditionalist and not concerned. He really doesn't care how he's received in the West. He's writing really from a very sort of basic gut level as a traditional sheikh and a Sufi sheikh as well. And you might think, well, Sufis are more open-minded. Well, that's not the issue. Sufism is about mysticism, and it covers all aspects of Muslims, or at least it's represented in all kinds of Muslim contexts. It has been over the centuries. So anyway, basically he's a traditionalist. And not ashamed of it in any sense in front of a Western audience. And then Abul A'la al-Mawdudi, his pamphlet Human Rights in Islam, he is the most articulate 20th century Islamist. I mean, he founded the Jamaat-e-Islami, so his own political party, first in India and then what became Pakistan, continued, and it's in Bangladesh, it's in several other countries in South Asia and beyond. It's sort of the parallel of the Muslim Brotherhood, although they don't have direct links that I know of. But anyway, Maududi, very influential, wrote a lot more than Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. He was a really highly trained scholar. So the third one would be the 1981 Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, the UIDHR. Drafted in London under the banner or umbrella of the Muslim World League. That was founded by Saudi Arabia and very much sort of towing that Wahhabi conservative line, and presented to UNESCO. Noticeable inconsistencies between the Arabic and English versions. Anne Mayer points those out as she goes along. Then you have the 1979 Iranian constitution, stating what rights are recognized in the Shia theocratic state, which she recognizes is actually a lot more open and a lot more, quote, progressive than some of these others, certainly Tabandi or even Maududi. The 1993 Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam, presented to the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. That's the CDHRI, and we'll get back to that. Now, why is it important? Well, it's much more important than the UIDHR in the sense that it was presented to the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, so endorsed by the 57-member Organization of Islamic Cooperation in 1990. Then it was the Organization of Islamic Conference. Now it's cooperation. Improbably, it was strongly promoted by the KSA, or the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. So, I say improbably because those are very sort of right-restricting kinds of states. Post-U.S. invasion constitutions of Afghanistan and Iraq. Americans had a lot of input, but really it is authored by Afghans and Iraqis. So she explains her focus here on page 3. The main concern here is Islamic human rights schemes that set forth compromised positions. These purport to represent definitive Islamic counterproposals of human rights, borrowing from the international formulations, but reworking them in ways that circumscribe rights and superimposing Islamic qualifications on these. None of these have been ratified by universal Islamic consensus. No such thing. Well, to begin with, there is no such thing, and certainly these documents have not been ratified in any kind of way, and certainly not by anything like democratic referenda. Instead, they have been promoted by undemocratic governments and various ideologues with views hostile to rights and freedoms. Okay, she's setting out basically her bottom line thesis. The focus of such compromise positions does not mean that they are more authentically Islamic than any other views on the relationship of Islam and human rights. They offer attractive subjects for investigation because they reveal the conflicting trends presently affecting what are supposedly Islamic approaches to human rights. So are they authentic? No, of course not. They're not authentic, but by looking at them and comparing them, and Mayer is saying, they are very, very enlightening when it comes to the background and the motivation of these Muslim organizations or ideologues like Maududi or Tabande, what they were trying to do and what was motivating them. Mayer's method of analysis is comparative law. That's what she's using. She's teaching, after all, at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, which is a business school, but she also teaches in the law school. Most of her career as a law professor was at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So she's business law. So yes, it's not exactly corresponding, but that's what she ended up being specialized in. And her first book was so useful that it went into a second edition, third edition. Now it's in its fifth edition. These schemes are opaque. What does she mean by that? Well, this correlates with the way that Middle Eastern governments have, for the most part, sought to maintain pretense of respect for international human rights, even while seeking to degrade it. So, yes, on the surface, everyone is attracted and wants to be seen as observing international human rights because it's something that everyone admires. But these are autocratic, despotic regimes, and so or people. I mean, with those tendencies. So obviously there's a big disconnect there. The many factors feeding behind or feeding into these Islamic human rights schemes, and this is what we'll continue to dwell upon for the rest of our lecture. Many factors. This is me trying to, thumb through the book and find different things that are behind. Why would individuals, states, groups want to set up, wannabe kinds of declarations of human rights, and yet, make all kinds of exceptions in them, or changes and tweaking them in such a way that they're more Islamic, while still appearing to be, these are human rights, and we're all in the same boat here. So that's the interesting thing. Okay, I'm going to say that the trauma of the colonial period, when for the first time Muslims were under the thumb of non-Muslims, plus perceived neocolonialism today. So colonial period and plus today's neocolonialism, along with Western double standards. I think from the Muslim perspective, that would be the place to start. The representatives of the 7 Muslim majority nations involved in the drafting of the UDHR, at the time, as I said before, those representatives were more liberal Muslims. Again, that's difficult to define, but they were not the traditionalists. They were pro-democratic, very much pro-human rights. The Islamic awakening of the late 1970s, that's the third point we're going to cover, that's a huge factor. And that accounted for Muslims wanting to, not ignoring, but saying, wait a minute, we can't just take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights norms as gospel law, Quranic law. Islamic law. We have to draw a distinction here. The general authoritarianism of Muslim post-colonial regimes versus the traditional conflation of religion and state in Islamicate countries. That'll be our last point. All right. Many Muslim states joined a group of Asian states in the 1990s using culture to wiggle out of past human rights commitments. Based on Karen Engel's research, she quotes Karen Engel here, when invoked against human rights universality, culture could be a proxy for many different concerns, including preserving national sovereignty, prioritizing economic and social rights, protecting the right of development over civil and political rights, or opposing Western double standards in applying rights. So culture is a stand-in for other concerns, right? National sovereignty, we're protecting our own stake, our own status, our own territory here, our own sovereignty. We're prioritizing economic and social rights. What we need is development. We're a poor country and we need to grow our economy. And so issues of civil and political rights are, kind of secondary. Protecting the right to development over civil, I already said. That's similar. All right. Or opposing Western double standards in applying rights. Yeah, we mentioned those and we'll get back to them too. Finally, all in all, the International Bill of Human Rights, so that's the Universal Declaration and the two covenants coming into force in 1976, have been ratified by a large majority of Muslim nations. And as she writes, the UDHR has over time achieved the status of customary international law. That's, highest authority you get, highest legitimacy you can get in international law. As such, is deemed binding on states regardless of whether they have ratified any of the conventions, any conventions at all. Still, whether you sign it or not, you are still bound by it as far as the UN and the sort of the consensus of the international body. Now, the first one I want to look at is colonialism and neo-colonialism. Don't underestimate the power of the MENA collective memory, MENA, Middle East and North Africa. It goes back to the Crusades. It's as if they had happened yesterday. And here I'm going to go into some history, more so than Mayer does, because I think you're going to benefit from what people in that part of the world actually think about a lot. We didn't study that in school. This is unknown to them, but they have, and they talk about it today. They all know about it, and it affects their policy making. Okay, the colonial period started, at least symbolically, with Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1798. I mean, Britain was already in India, or already, well, with the East India Company, they were already trading and had a presence and were already manipulating some things in different areas. But Britain's Middle East policy. Okay, now let me just focus on the Middle East here. Leave India alone for now. Hold on to its crown jewel, India. Okay, but that was the biggest part of its colonial holdings. But in the Middle East, they wanted to secure the roots. So Egypt was very important for that, in particular. Sudan below also. Egypt for the Suez Canal, and then Palestine, Transjordan. Secure Persian Gulf oil for its navy. So the Persian Gulf, in those days, people derisingly said, well, the British lake. Yes. Oversee the breakup of the Ottoman Empire to its advantage, hence 3 diplomatic initiatives. And we will see several of them. I'm not sure how systematic I'll be here, but anyway, France's objectives were more fuzzy, though. As opposed to the British, hold on to North Africa, except Lydia, invaded by Italy in 1911. But France, as you know, invaded Algeria in 1830, and not just invaded, I mean, they annexed it and they brought their people there. And so when that very bloody Algerian war took place, almost 1 million French colonists had been there for something like 7 or 8 generations, moved back to France. it was traumatic for France. Traumatic. Protect Middle East Christians. Lebanon is an invention of the French to secure a country that would be majority Christian. Now, of course, their birth rate wasn't as high as Muslims, and problems flared up in 1975, 75 to 90, the Civil War. And the third one was the 1904 Entente Cordiale, cordial agreement. Take Morocco, leave Egypt to Britain. Still, France remained the Ottomans' biggest lender. Well, North Africa was tied to the Ottoman Empire anyway. So that's why that connection was there. Some indigenous state builders were mildly pro-Western, yet strong nationalists at the same time. You have Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, strong secularist. Reza Shah Pahlavi, also secularist. Mohammed V in Morocco, definitely more religious. Habib Bourguiba in Tunisia, very secularist. Others, like King Saud, founder of Saudi Arabia in the 1920s, made alliances with Western powers in order to achieve their goals. I mean, that's the whole thing about Lawrence of Arabia. Spy trying to inspire or help create the uprising of this Saudi warlord against his Ottoman sovereigns. So Britain latched on to Mecca's ruler. There he is, Hussein ibn Ali, as a useful ally, launching that revolt, I guess, against the Ottomans in 1916. There it is. All right, October 1916, the French and British finalized the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing the Middle East into spheres of influence. That's the first step. Then you have, well, okay, let's talk about it. Britain controls Iraq, the Arabian Peninsula, Transjordan. Palestine remains an international zone. France controls Greater Syria. So you have Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. In July 1920, that's the second phase, the French march on Damascus, depose Sharif Hussein's son, and put him on the throne of Iraq. Wow. Talk about manipulating politics, right? Britain, Winston Churchill, put Sharif Hussein's other son, on the throne of newly created Emirate of Transjordan, becoming Jordan. If you wondered where the monarchy in Jordan came from, the British put them there. And of course, a big part of their legitimacy has to do with their being descendants of Muhammad, a Sharifian, that's so-called Sharifian legitimacy. November 2nd, 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued. Just a seemingly small, innocent paper, but it was long in the making, and it contradicted some of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Here's the relevant part. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done that may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status of Jews in any other country. So yes, we will help the Jews establish their home in Palestine, even though it says here clearly, this should not prejudice the rights of the existing Palestinian population. That's easier said than done, right? British Jews didn't like it at first, but there seems to be three main motives for it. Politically, Britain was likely appealing to US Jews to put pressure on their government to get more involved in World War I. We're going to help the Jewish people. You better fight, join the Americans and fight Hitler. I mean, that's before Hitler, but fight Germany. Probably too, the Russian Jews as well, now ruled by the Bolsheviks. That's one possible motive. Personal reasons, many British leaders were pro-Zionist Christians, evangelicals. Think of Darby, the Schofield Bible. All that came out of the Second Great Awakening in Britain. I mean, there were other spin-offs too, but that's one of them. A lot of people in British government were very pro-Israel for those reasons. It was that dispensationalism was coming to the fore. It was a big part of their their theology and piety. And third, Britain's imperial ambitions was still at the height of its game and could assert its power. Absolutely. And then April 1920, the San Remo Conference, later ratified by the League of Nations, making the French and British trustees of these territories. So you have this idea of mandate. And compared to the French, the Britons get more territory. This was only in the MENA region. The Dutch ruled Indonesia, don't forget. The French, British, Germans, and Belgians had carved out different parts of Africa. So Western colonialism was almost omnipresent, a huge force to be reckoned with. India was basically ruled by the British, taken from the Muslim Mughal Empire from the 1780s to 1947, a long period of time. There were also latent tensions between Muslims and Hindus which flared up after World War II. And then with the independence of India and Pakistan, 1947, which was a very bloody process. We're talking about 500,000 people killed, 12 million displaced. Colonialism and decolonialism was not a smooth process by any means. Afghanistan till today has not been independent. I mean, Afghans, yeah, technically are, but the Americans are still there, and the Taliban is still fighting them and fighting the Afghan government, which is seen by the Taliban as puppets, American puppets. The British interfered directly in Egypt until World War II. The French annexed Algeria, as I said before. In 1954, the War of Independence broke out. There were over 1 million colonists living there. They all came back to France after an 8-year war that killed at least 700,000 Algerians and about 35,000 French. There you have it in a nutshell. Neocolonialism since the 1960s. Plenty of evidence for that. Just one example. The Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, had been democratically elected. And the year before that, he had nationalized, well, the year before 1951, 1951, he nationalized the British oil industry in Iran. Obviously, the British weren't too happy about that. 2 years later, the CIA and MI6 helped to spark a popular revolution against him, forcing him out of power. The Iranians still talk about that today. You know, nobody's forgotten Mossadegh and the American, CIA ousted our president. 1979 revolution was in large part fomented against the Shah's perceived subservience to the West, undoubtedly. U.S. support for the Mujahideen, those fighting jihad, that's what Mujahideen means, the Soviets in the 1980s, and bin Laden. We armed and equipped bin Laden, not entirely, but we certainly gave him a lot of money and some arms. U.S. vetoes in the UN against all resolutions calling for Israel to withdraw from occupied territories. That was just a given. It's hard to call us a neutral power broker. I mean, especially today, but even all along. U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq would be other examples of neocolonialism. In the eyes of the locals. I mean, you can debate it, but that's how they see it. Double standards, well, you have the U.S. deployment of human rights rhetoric in the MENA, criticizing a lot of the governments. We list every year human rights violations by different countries, and we rank them in terms of the most egregious and the least egregious, I guess. But there's a staggering death toll among civilians following invasions. With our drones, both in Pakistan and Yemen, we've killed untold hundreds of civilians. Financial mismanagement, I mean, billions of dollars were wasted in Afghanistan in particular, and Iraq. Egregious violations of prisoners, as far as those were pictures that went around the world that just destroyed any kind of goodwill towards the American occupation of Iraq. Strong Muslim support for human rights from 1947 on. This is one of the factors behind the human rights schemes. Why? Because there was this initial momentum backing it. And so when the Sahwa, so when the Islamic resurgence happened, that produced a counter reaction. But in the beginning, there was a strong sympathy and support for human rights law. We mentioned Eleanor Roosevelt's role, but she was the only American. Three of the most influential people, René Cassin mentioned it, and his young Iranian scholar, Freidoun Hoveyda, Charles Melick, and the Chinese diplomat, Confucian scholar, Peng Chung-chang. So, it was signed by Afghanistan, as I mentioned before, all those countries, but only the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia abstained. Muslim nations very active in the third committee working on the two covenants. And by the way, I believe at least the second one, Charles Melick was the chair. I know that he took Eleanor Roosevelt's place. So the Lebanese Christian. I don't know who led the third committee. But anyway, all Muslim nations voted for them, while the U.S. stayed out of the process and never ratified either one. Well, it did ratify the first, but only after many reservations that almost nullified its effect, she writes. Yeah, that's a civil and political rights. You'd think that we would have signed that one. One reason for official Muslim support coming out of colonialism, quote, they were naturally enthusiastic backers of self-determination and were united in denouncing the human rights violations that European colonialism had perpetrated, as well as the hypocrisy of European states that gave lip service to human rights that they were unwilling to grant to subjugated populations in their colonies. Okay, a long way to put it, but these newly independent countries were very keen to point their fingers at the double standards of European nations, ex-colonists, colonial powers, and what they were doing now. And human rights was a way to leverage their own power against them. Makes sense. Still, ongoing French manipulation of its former American colonies, that's not in the book, but I'm telling you that because I have friends. Of course, I grew up, you don't know that, but my parents were missionaries in France. I grew up in France, French schools a little bit. And so I talked, we have a very close friend, a doctor here who is from the Central African Republic. I've heard it from others as well, but there's a lot of resentment of France. There's one currency in West Africa, and it's upheld by French currency, and it's a way of manipulating those economies, and the French are still doing terrible stuff. I mean, and this is, a very soft-spoken, wonderful Christian brother. I mean, we're talking about, this is politics, and this is Africans saying that, that colonial power is still oppressing us, still, got its boot over our necks. All right, note 2, Muslim states have uneven records of ratifying the major human rights conventions. Okay, uneven. But that word uneven does remind us that there is no consensus on one set of Islamic human rights principles that is being followed. Muslims disagree on a lot of these things. They agree that they're not quite comfortable with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as it stands, and some of the articles of the two major conventions, and CEDAW and other ones like that. But still, they're debating among themselves and disagree about a lot of some of the specifics. Surprising allies. I thought this was interesting. Muslim nations with the Vatican and sometimes the U.S. When it comes to anti-abortion kinds of issues, right to life, they work very well together on that. Yes, and abortion issues is one of the reasons why the U.S. doesn't sign a lot of these treaties. Yeah, at least part of it. Okay, so now we're talking about the Islamic resurgence. This may be the most significant factor. I I would vote for that one. The Sahwa, the Awakening, itself a part of a wider revival of religion around the world. And Martin E. Marty from the University of Chicago and Scott Appleby at Notre Dame University co-edited a series of 5 big volumes of articles written by a variety of scholars from various disciplines, chronicling, documenting the revival of religion in the 1980s and early 1990s. So it's, wow. So it's not just Muslims, but it's Pentecostals in Latin America. I mean, Christianity spread by leaps and bounds, but it's Hindus that became, very nationalistic at that time, and Buddhists, and the war in Sri Lanka, of course, helped that. But there's, Israel, the ideological settlers in the West Bank. It's all because of, God gave us these territories. So that's the fundamentalism project in a nutshell. So that also triggered, it was also triggered by the literal defeat of Pan-Arabism and its secular socialist ideology promoted by Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. He died in 1970, that's another watershed. But the 6-day war in 1967 was really what already cut his power way down. So he limped along 3 more years and then died. But he was a great hero for 2 decades, not only in the Arab world, but among the movement and non-aligned movement and throughout the world, but especially among many, many Muslims. Then especially the Islamic Revolution of Iran, huge repercussions. Today we don't imagine that because there's such a tension between Shiites, or the Shia, and the Sunnis. And now it's, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, just 2 powers trying to control the Middle East. Iran has the military power, but Saudi Arabia has oil money, and it also has friends, and it's got other ways of projecting power. And the Saudi petrodollars, that's a huge, we talked about their manipulating of the Muslim World League and creating that one declaration of Islamic human rights. But they've been spreading their puritanical Wahhabi ideology all around the world, building mosques and giving money to this and that, but always with strings attached. In this course, your best view on this comes in week 7. You'll see when you read my 2-part blog on Layla Ahmed's book. Harvard scholar Layla Ahmed writes, grew up in Egypt, The Quiet Revolution, the Veil's Resurgence from Middle East to America. So I wrote a 2-part blog review of that, and then you'll see just very graphically how this resurgence affected Egypt and the surrounding countries, but it's mostly focused on Egypt, and how the Muslim Brotherhood really, from the bottom up, really rode that wave very, very adroitly. All right, Reed and Mayer's section called The Impact of Islamization on Constitutions and Justice. She covers Iran, Sudan, Pakistan, the Taliban, and KSA, although very little. Note 2, as you read in her chapter 3, Islamic Tradition, as you read that, note that the Sahwa is the impetus that pushes Muslim governments in more traditional conservative directions. They enact new laws. They put in their constitutions, Islam is the source of legislation. So the Sharia is the source. Sociologically, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, founded in 1928, was the first modern Muslim mass movement. Politically, it had politically active parties in Jordan, Yemen, Syria, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, etc. The Islamist vision, that was the Islamist vision, one nation under God, sound familiar, right? Often coalesced with more traditional elements to form opposition parties just about everywhere. They overplayed their hand in Egypt in 2012. It lasted only a year, and Colonel Sisi took over. All right, despotism plus Din wa Dawla. Din wa Dawla is the Arabic expression for state and religion. So religion wedded to politics tradition. Human rights mostly protect individual rights. Okay, historically, that's what it was in Europe and in the US, because it was a bulwark against despotism. Right? You read the Declaration of Independence. It's about personal rights, but it's also, well, but also collective in the sense that it was the British Crown that was, forcing, taxing their tea and controlling their lives, whereas they wanted to be independent. Pilgrims fleeing religious persecution, right? And then you had the fallout of the 30-day war. 30-year war, 7-day war, and this is a 30-year war. Protestants against Catholics, very bloody war. And that was just the end of it all. But still, there had been fighting and bloodshed for 2 centuries before that. That's 1648. So Europeans said enough. Christianity is a following Christianity and politics is a formula for civil war and chaos. Khaled Abu Fadl, we'll talk a lot about in this class, shows that classical Islam recognized both individual and collective rights, though not in modern terms. Mayer says these schemes are designed to protect the collective at the expense of the individual. So it's pushback against the Universal Declaration by saying, yes, individual rights, but what primes are collective rights. She mentions historical factors too. Think about it. Sunni authorities gradually become wary of reason and leaned on ethical voluntarism. Remember that something is right because God says it is. So you stick to the text very strictly. Shia, much less than the Sunnis. The Mu'tazilites, the rationalists, were condemned. That's in the 10th century. They lost a lot of power when there were 3 caliphs in a row that upheld that doctrine of the created Quran. That was the height of the Mu'tazilite power, and it's, and when that was broken, that persecution, they call it, mihna, was broken, and Ibn Hanbal, who had been defending the eternal Quran, the great hero, popular hero, was again elevated to the rank of leading scholar. That was the end of the Mu'tazilites and rationalism in the Sunni world, pretty much. And even philosophy, which continued for a while in the Sunni areas, was kind of a sideshow, whereas it was much more important in the Shia world. All right, I argue in my 2004 seminal article, and it was seminal because it was, it's a God thing. I just stumbled into it because I was reading North African writers at the time, writing about that, and I got interested. It drew me in, and I started theorizing about it just to make sense of it myself. And I ended up writing this 50-page paper that, it got, because it's peer-reviewed, and but the editor, David Powers, was of Islamic Law and Society, worked with me, and almost every sentence got worked on. But anyway, it was something important, and I'm very grateful for that help the Lord gave me. But anyway, I document the gradual turn towards the objectives of Sharia in the 20th century. So in legal theory, and I was asked by the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islamic Law to write a long article on 20th century legal theory. So that was a privilege. That was fun. Well, anyway, a reassertion of reason at the expense of traditional Sunni consensus. I continue in this vein in the Maqasid al-Sharia article, which you will read, and that's easier to read, believe me. Okay, so Mayer rightly says this emphasis on revelation over reason pushed human rights schemes to emphasize duties over rights. See, there's a connection there. God tells you to do this, do this, do this, and rights, they're God rights. We'll talk more about those. Huquq Allah, but human rights take a back seat to human duties. She's also right to assert that there are plenty of resources in the Islamic sources and theological legal tradition to build a robust philosophy and theology of human rights. And Khaled Abou Fadl and others will show the way. We'll see that she's right. Now, this long section of Muslim reactions to Western constitutionalism. Here we have 19th century and early 20th century reformers, Muhammad Abdu, who agreed with the Western trained political elites that constitutionalism was a necessary protection for the people against their governments. So it's a defensive position. The modern state is centralized. It's much more powerful than the traditional states that ruled Muslim lands. And there needs to be a bulwark. There needs to be protection against that. And constitutionalism is a necessary preventative step, defensive move. That said, in most countries, the traditional ulama were mostly opposed, and for that reason, bypassed. Of course, all these changes was over their own heads and was sidelining them. You can see why they weren't, but some of them realized that this is the way of the future, and so they agreed to help, draw up some of the law codes, but kind of not very happily. These imported law codes from the West were making their role mostly redundant by now. So let me quote here. In sum, one can say that Islamic clerics were divided and have remained so on whether constitutionalism, an institution that is of central importance for the protection of human rights, is compatible with the Sharia. Controversies in this area have been aggravated as contemporary Islamization programs have tended to collaborate with the degradation, corroborate, I think it is. I think corroborate with the degradation of constitutionalism, the suspension of constitutions, or in the case of the Taliban, a complete rejection of constitutionalism as an alien Western idea. How about the persistence of traditional priorities and values? What does she say? Well, human rights schemes have latched on to the Sunni endorsement of ethical voluntarism and the very limited use of human reason. For example, here, listen to the preamble of the Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights. Divine revelation has provided, quote, the legal and moral framework within which to establish and regulate human institutions and relationships. Now, those human institutions and relationships, that's the muamalat versus the ibadat, the rituals. Sharia says there's no wiggle room there. But in the muamalat, in human relations, there is not a whole lot in the Quran or the Sunnah. And most of that is up for people to legislate with their own, as they see fit and adapt to their own times and places. So this is a step back, getting, pushing reason out and putting more to the fore revelation. Also, duties over rights. Okay, you can see it here. It is therefore obvious from the outset that the UIDHR will have the effect of denying rights in the guise of establishing Islamic duties. The ready-made defense will be that Islam aims not to secure individual rights, but to ensure obedience to divine commands. All right. A telling context for the speech by Pakistani Minister of Law and Religious Affairs, A.K. Brohi, after President Zia's coup and execution of the former Prime Minister Ali Bhutto, right? She quotes him at length. What does Brohi say? He says, human duties and rights have been vigorously defined, and their orderly enforcement is the duty of the whole of organized communities, and the task is specifically entrusted to the law enforcement organs of the state. The individual, if necessary, has to be sacrificed in order that the life of the organism be saved. Collectivity has a special sanctity attached to it in Islam. So you can see here where the downgrading or diluting of human rights corroborates with authoritarian governments wanting to be in control. Collectivity, yes, the main collectivity, of course, is the state. And we're keeping our people together, so don't fall out of line. Western man's perspective, he continues, may by and large be called anthropocentric in the sense that there is that there, man is regarded as measure of everything, since he is to be regarded as the starting point of all thinking and action. Well, a lot of Christians, and we would say that man is not, and that's part of the problem in the Enlightenment discourse. We would agree with some of that. But then again, you don't want to be naive when it comes to human sin and the power of authoritarian governments, or governments, period. I mean, power corrupts. You've got to find a way to dilute it. Mayer argues that Brohy doesn't grasp what a game changer the modern state, dramatically more centralized and powerful, is in the equation. No wonder that authoritarian states like that of Zia's Pakistan gladly adopted this reasoning. You can see why, this relatively obscure cleric writing on these issues, he's a Sufi sheikh at the same time. His writings are, gobbled up and used very happily by the government because it bolsters their own authority. Put otherwise, she says, his notion that in an Islamic system one cannot separate the individual and the government reflects adherence to the pre-modern jurist's view that the ruler and ruled stood together, united in their duties of obedience to the Sharia. Where there is a reliance on such anachronistic views, the reality is that individual rights are being crushed by anti-democratic regimes is naturally not given weight. Yes, individual rights are being crushed by these authoritarian regimes. International law, however, gives priority to individual rights so as to protect these civil and political rights against, quote, infringements, particularly by governments, but also by society. And that's an important point to emphasize. Individual rights over collective rights. This is why, contends Mayer, contrary to what a cultural relativist position might dictate, she says, in the Middle East, the absence of legal protections for human rights is correlated with patterns of misrule, injustice, corruption, and oppression by despotic rulers that are similar to those historically experienced in the West. And that's why, you had the Arab Spring. Spontaneous movement. We want freedom. That's a natural human cry. Consequence of insecure philosophical foundations, she writes. Okay, in this section, she mentions several Islamic scholars, jurists and activists, who lack a coherent human rights philosophy. They write about it, but there's no philosophy behind it, really. It's bits and pieces here and there, sound bites that aren't really thought through, thought over, and particularly their connection to Islamic theology. A little social science would help dispel these idealized visions of social harmony divorced from reality. Yes, that would help indeed. All right, hence the confusion of what a right actually is. So you have examples of frivolous rights, she calls them. Right to not have your corpse mutilated. Women's right not to have male relatives intruding on them by surprise in their own homes, right? Right not to be insulted or derided, or the right of divorced individuals to strict confidentiality on the part of their former spouses. See, here, human rights are being confused with legal duties. All these areas could be covered by tort or criminal law. That's not what human rights are about, she says. Others fall specifically under the category of Islamic duties. The right to cooperate in the case of cause of virtue. Well, yes, the Quran at least 6 or 7 times enjoins Muslims to enjoin the good, command the good, and forbid evil. And then the right to spread Islam and its message to everyone. So the right to dawah, right to share your faith. Yes, I suppose that could become a right in the West, where it might be contested, or something like that. But generally, these are Islamic duties. Islamic human rights and cultural colonialism. Cultural colonialism. Mayer says that these schemes today betray a defensive reaction in light of one's feeling of shame, wounded pride, helpless, and inferior to the Western civilization. There's a sense of inferiority complex here, especially when they were dominant for so long. That glorious past of ours, and look where we are today, being humiliated, trampled on. the bane of the world, as Muslims. So she writes, resentment of this dependency can engender efforts to assert cultural autonomy, to defend institutions associated with Muslims' cultural heritage against charges of backwardness, and to offer counter models to Western ideas and institutions. Another consequence are cultural confusion. She says, now think about it. Maududi quotes Western scientists who say that Western freedoms have led to social disaster. Okay, how does that relate? Well, especially, how does it relate to her conclusion, which says that women should be submissive and secluded at home? I mean, Maududi concludes that. Or Tabande saying that the fact that women can't vote in Switzerland until 1971 confirms the Sharia. What are you proving there? So they're confusing again, cultural and political and theological issues. Ambivalent attitudes toward human rights. And I end with this. Mayer senses that even as they promote these Islamic human rights schemes, these authors, quote, seem to regard international human rights as the ultimate model from which they do not want to be seen as deviating. It's attractive, these human rights norms, hence the apologetic and defensive tone. Another indication of this is that these schemes have no clear Islamic theology theory undergirding them. They merely assemble pastiches of ideas and terminology drawn from two very different cultures. And she makes clear that scholars like Abdullahi and Naim and Khalid Abu Fadl have shown that, a Muslim with a deep understanding of the resources in Islamic heritage can mine these to elaborate meaningful human rights on an Islamic foundation. Yeah. So we'll end with that, and we will continue. I will continue with Qaradawi.